Welcome to the Revenue Rewired podcast, hosted by StringCan Interactive's visionary CEO, Jay Feitlinger, and no-nonsense COO, Sarah Shepard. We're here to accelerate your revenue and give your marketing purpose. All right. Hello, and welcome to this next episode of the Revenue Rewired podcast. Hello, Jay.
Good morning, Sarah. How are you?
Good evening.
How's Manchester?
It is beautiful and lovely, although I'm missing a beautiful week in Phoenix, I hear.
It's beautiful this morning.
Well, we have some pretty exciting stuff. We're going to talk about sandwiches. Just kidding. We're going to talk about the middle 60% of your sales team, but this made me think of sandwiches because Scott, our facilitator, taught us the 20-60-20. I mean, we knew it, but he taught us the whole platform and how it applies to our last quarterly planning meeting, which was pretty interesting. And I thought, like, what if a sandwich had that 20-60-20? Like the 60% is the middle of the sandwich. What if you only cared about one slice of bread? That would be a pretty crappy sandwich.
An open face.
I don't know, but when you were thinking about the 20-60-20 rule, which we'll explain in a second, what popped into your head? Because I doubt it was sandwiches.
No, it went right into being a middle child.
Oh my gosh. Tell me more.
I've been tortured my whole life. You know, it's funny. I have so many friends that even like my oldest kid, Lexi, we had this chat recently about, she wants to be a mom as soon as possible. I asked her to wait a little bit because she's only 20. But she was really having this debate with us about should I have two or three or four? I don't want to have three because then the one kid is left out. I'm like, oh my goodness. But there's a lot of interesting studies around the middle child. And so, again, I think this episode I have that leg up where I could think about it from that point of view. And then also, I think it's having kids. I often correlate thinking about really hard business stuff as far as how would I, chat with my kiddos about stuff and try to make things easier to understand because I think we overcomplicate some of this stuff.
The middle child thing is actually so appropriate for this. And I'm thinking about my own siblings. So, okay, well, let's explain first the 20-60-20 application to sales.
Are we jump in?
Yeah.
Want me to go forward? Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm curious how you're going to spin this.
Well, I mean, I think it's really straightforward. So, in the sales careers or jobs that I've had, and then coaching businesses and looking at their sales organizations, this is very, very common. Where let's say, for example, you had 100 salespeople. Typically you might have that 80-20 rule, where maybe the top 20% are delivering 80% of the revenue goals and whatnot. And then you have your bottom 20. And what most organizations do, or parents, if you want to go down that analogy, is you invest so much energy in focusing on the top and then the bottom. And then you often just forget about the middle. And that's really where it comes into play, where typically, there's significant opportunity happening in that messy, that middle area. And that's really what it's all about, is you have the top 20%, bottom 20%, and the remaining 60% is really where you have some significant scale opportunity.
Yeah, I think, it's easy to, gosh, when you add the top and the bottom, you're still only at 40%. Like, what a gap. That 60%, using the middle child analogy, they are often forgotten. It's just sort of easy to, just like in our lives, we focus on like high moments and low moments, and they ruminate in our minds over and over again. But the rest of our lives just kind of happens. Like, have you ever gone to work and you're not sure how you got there? I feel like that's part of the 60% of your life, or the parts that you just sort of set it and forget it. And it's probably one of the biggest opportunities for organizations with sales teams that are performing inside this 20-60-20. And wouldn't you sort of say, with your experience, it's pretty typical of the majority of them? You
Yeah,
have
again,
maybe
it's
even small teams, right?
exactly. I mean, again, Yeah, obviously the team is too small. Like if you have like, 3 or 5 people, this makes it a little harder because there's a lot more variables in play. It's a little easier to see how obvious this is on a larger team that's, 30 plus salespeople. But what happens, again, it happens, and I think it's subconscious sometimes where leadership is rewarding the top 10 and then they're penalizing the bottom. And then it's the middle is just drifting along. And I think that lack of focus on that 60% is really where you're impacting and hurting your pipeline. And so I think when you look at it high level, I'm not saying that, you should ignore the top 10, 20 and the bottom 20. But I think you have to be thinking about how you're coaching the middle 60. And that's really where I see huge potential because often what I have found when I looked at it is, after you get through the top performers, those middle 60% type, segment of your sales team, they already have a good understanding typically of your product or service. They just need some enablement. They need some coaching. And that's what I think we should maybe focus on a little bit in this episode is like what could leadership team members do with that 60% because there is typically huge potential there. And again, I as a middle child, that happened to me where, typically the firstborn gets all this, extra love and protection because it's your first kid and you worry about it. And then the middle child comes along and which was me and you're tired and you're like, they'll figure it out. And then either it's a whoopsie or it's a planned, third. And now you forgot, what it was like having the first or second. And then all of a sudden you have this, typically a new level of excitement where you can like, make the third one better. And, the middle child is like, what is going on here? And that's how I felt, most of my life. And, I have been unfortunately in that 60% in sales teams before. And being that I'm very driven or as you say, competitive,
Competitive.
um, so hopefully in a nice way. I hated not being a top performer. And so I was driven enough to try to figure out ways because I wasn't given that support and coaching to help me become a top performer. All this energy I was watching was either recognizing and rewarding the top, people and with, contests and benefits and bonuses and recognition and whatnot. And then the bottom ones were just fired. And it just became a really problematic thing where no one was focusing on, that 60% group.
Yeah, we've heard this from some of our agency friends who've, been at corporate gigs before where the 20% gets all the attention, which isn't fair to give them all of the attention. But I can understand why, because typically the top 20%, or if you're following 20/80 rule, could be driving 80% of your, pipeline, which is fantastic. However, wouldn't you want to create some sort of backfill and use the 60% to learn from the 20%? Because I could see sales top performers totally turning over quickly. They figure it out. They've totally nailed the gig. They've gotten everything they can out of it. They're going to use it to level up and go to another opportunity. I mean, I would if I was good at sales and, wasn't super awkward in them. But I think that's where, there's such a gap, and I can appreciate the energy and effort trying to be spent on the 20% on both sides. There's managing up or managing out is kind of typically how it goes.
Yep.
And, your top performers usually are kind of like performing their best most of the time. The bottom ones, you're trying to manage up or out because they're dragging down your reputation, your performance, they're creating bottlenecks. Like they're just causing a lot more problems, and your focus is so myopic. I would say that typically the energy is spent more on taking the bottom 20% out. And then the 60% is like, hey, we're still here too, trying to do our best. Does anyone care? So what what kind of advice would you give being on both sides of this? Like how would you manage up the majority middle that's sort of being ignored?
Well, I can tell you what I recommend do not doing first, because this is what I often see happening. And again, I've been guilty of this too. Um, I just kind of Freudian slip there, I guess, a little bit. But what I was going to share is that what I've seen a lot of companies do is they really care about their people often, and they don't believe that the problem is them. They believe it's some kind of system or process or tool. And so then they go and they start adding on more and more layers of tech stack to try to solve the problem. And what I have found typically is when you really dissect and remove all of the excuses, it comes down to just they needing more clarity. And that is, I think, where the biggest opportunity is. It's like, what to say and how to say it and how it aligns to the customer pain. So I think step number one is similar to how we do the marketing for our clients is that blueprint is you need to have a really smart blueprint in place based upon every kind of scenario with the top 20%, bottom 20%, the middle 60, and making sure that starting out that everyone is clear on who we are and what we do and what makes us special. And I think once you have that done, then I think with the 60%, there's a couple of things that I've personally done that I've seen to be really effective, regardless of your personality or the product or service. But I think one of the first things is often people that are in sales, when you are just consistently week after week not hitting your goals, it does really mess with your head, and you start having all these kind of negative thoughts about is this the wrong job for me, and it requires a lot of just consistent week after week after week working the system. But I think what can happen is a really strong leader could do like micro coaching where maybe you have like a weekly kind of session where you're really investing a level of energy into the people that have the potential to be top performers. They just need some micro assistance on like, oh, well, I listened to the last 5 calls you did, and here is, one thought about maybe trying it differently. So I think that could be a really big one. The second one, again, this only works well if the company is a healthy culture. Because again, some organizations intentionally make it a very cutthroat sales environment where it's like, everyone for themselves. And so in that kind of model, this second recommendation wouldn't work well. But I've worked in a few different sales organizations, and two of them actually did a really good job with this, with like peer driven like labs type of concept where you have like a reverse shadowing idea with those top performers. It's almost like if you go to a new camp or an event and they have like a not a mentor but a person kind of holding your hand.
Like a big brother, big sister kind of thing.
Exactly. And I think
Yeah.
that I know for me, in my first job, the manager of the branch I worked at, he really believed in the power of the team, and was very, very, positive about that. And so he would constantly have like the shadowing type opportunities where we would do like, role playing, where we would sit in a room and we'd have, one person be the client and then we'd be, the salesperson. To be honest, I was actually often more scared doing that in front of my peers than I did in front of the prospective clients. But I have to say, that was one of the most beneficial parts of that job that I had, where either as me being the person doing the work or just listening, I just would constantly pick up. I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting approach. I never would have thought about it that way. And I think the last part I think is all about that clarity side where what is my role? Who do I go to for help? Am I allowed to bring on an engineer from my team to help me close this deal? It's just weird how like when you're in sales, it's like, here's your product or service, go hit the street and, dial for dollars. And it's changed a lot with AI and whatnot over the years. But that theory and that mindset is kind of still sitting out there depending upon the company's growth goals. So I just think that, those are a couple of the ideas, but it really all starts with, again, the clarity of the business, and then the culture of the sales environment. Either it's going to be cutthroat or it's going to be more embracing. And again, for me, if I ever was going to go and get another job again in sales, um, I would want to make sure I work at a company that was very much, healthy like that. Also, it's just going to be a short-term opportunity.
Well, and I can understand how some businesses really struggle with taking time away from their high performers to help coach up peers. However, just even one story, which is yours, and it's saying how impactful that was for you, I think completely underscores it's necessary for others to learn from those who are doing it. Because for a lot of people, I think they overthink sales or they struggle and they want to be better at it, but it doesn't come as naturally. And those top 20 kind of, it's like the sell a ketchup popsicle to a woman in white gloves type of situation. Like there are those people, and there are things that they do that are natural, where that 60%, even if you just bump up 10%, and I mean, that's like half then of your top performers. You've totally
Hmm.
changed the whole skew of your entire revenue pipeline by just bumping up a couple people into a high performing category. So,
You know,
I think it is an investment.
yeah, and actually, you brought up a really good point. One more thing I want to maybe share. Is when I think about it from a leadership perspective, one of the challenges is, and again, I think most humans have experienced this. When you're feel like you're floundering and you're not hitting whatever the goals are, unless you don't care, but most people do, you just feel bad. And when you're in that situation and you have this kind of negative mindset, it's often really hard to understand what needs to happen to fix it, which is why I mentioned a couple of the other ideas, a few minutes ago, where people just need some help. And usually, the potential top performers that are in that 60%, you'd be amazed at how fast things could turn around. It's like, and even look with us, our agency, my role is heavy on the business development side. And, if I go more than a few weeks and I don't have any positive experiences, it really messes with my head, even though I have insane confidence around some of this stuff. So, one more thing I want to maybe suggest that you made me think about when you talked about some of like understanding details and whatnot, is if assuming the company has a good CRM in place, like Salesforce or HubSpot or whatever, and everyone's entering the right data, that alone could be really eye-opening. Where, again, if you're not in a mentally in a great place and you're struggling on the sales side, not hitting your goals, the easiest things of what is needed often is not obvious to that person. So, we think about like, one of our clients, like if you're a chief revenue officer or head of sales and marketing, one thing you can really do is pop into your CRM and look at, real-time diagnostics. Because what I have found typically is that yes, if you put everyone that 60% into one bucket and assume it's all because they aren't driven enough or they aren't following the playbook or whatever it might be, you actually might find that each person's obstacle of why they aren't a top performer might be a little different. And so, for example, you might have someone where they're really, really good at, securing a meeting, getting a buy-in for next step, creating a proposal, and then they have a big drop off there from proposal to contract, where someone else might be at the contract phase to close, or maybe at getting a meeting. And so I think if you can use enough history, again, it does take a few months at least to really understand, because if you expect someone in the first 30 days to be hitting goals, that's very unrealistic typically. I've seen a situation where it takes 6 to 12 months to uncover if the person's going to make it or not. So you have to make that investment in them. But I think if you can use like the CRM insights, understand exactly where that person might be having some stalling, that is one really big opportunity where you can really help them, because they likely aren't even aware of it. It's like, okay, we've noticed that, 90% of your issues of not closing deals is because of this one stage of your sales cycle. Now, here is Bob, and Bob is the best company in our organization for that. And then you now all of a sudden you're going into these meetings understanding where you have a gap. And I think that alone can give you amazing opportunity to be like, oh my gosh, if I just turn this one knob a little bit and try something maybe differently, my success could jump very, very quickly.
Okay, Jay. Well, that was pretty interesting. Something I am thinking about with dashboards and KPIs, I suspect, information is probably one of the keys to getting that 60% dialed up because if you don't have, and we've talked about this before, I think it's a lot of assumptions that all of your data is going into one place and it's feeding and telling the right story. And more often than not, we're talking with clients and prospects, and they have data all over the place. It's kind of like
Hmm.
at home, how many subscriptions does one person have? I guarantee most people, I think, what is the average? Like a dozen subscriptions. I think that's what's happened to a lot of tech stack, or we're going to call it Frankenstack, is there's just information all over the place. And if you don't have the right information to help lead the sales team and to grow that majority middle, then you're really in for a hard time. And that's probably why they're left floundering and feeling like middle child syndrome is because they don't know. Back to your point about where are they getting dropped off? Is it in the meeting? Is it in the proposal? They probably have no idea. And it's really hard, especially if you have a large sales team. That's a lot. It's a lot to
Hmm.
expect to go into one-on-ones all the time. So probably I would suspect creating better dashboards and having better information to drive those conversations would be really beneficial. But I want to throw out to you there's something I think we both have heard that creates, it's not necessarily a toxic culture, but there is one way in which sales teams can go, completely bi-directional. And that's one of the ways in which the organization compensates them. So tell our listeners a little bit about how compensation can impact sales teams' performance.
Okay, I love this one. Obviously, again, it does depend on the company, industry, etc., and the sales cycle. But I think for this one, I'm gonna probably use my kids as the analogies here because it does help me think about it differently. Um, so I think first of all, when I look at like I have two daughters, and those two could not be any more different than each other. And again, for me, one of the things that I learned early on in my career is understanding motivations. Um, and I am motivated by money. As many entrepreneurs are or business owners. And so with our first kid, I just use money as incentives as a typical like salesperson to try to get her to do things that were good for her and or our family. Things like doing chores and whatnot. And she definitely is motivated by that to this day. It's just hysterical how uh, the amount of money she can earn is a huge motivator for her. And so when our second kiddo came along, Ella, I thought that I would do the exact same thing, and it couldn't have failed more miserably. Where it just she's not motivated by money, but what she is motivated by is fancy food. She definitely is a foodie, and so for her, you do good on a test, and I'll take you out to sushi. It's like that kind of stuff, and I wouldn't call it manipulation, but obviously you can spin it any way you want. But I would think, that is really, really important. And so when I correlate that now back to your question about organizations, I think back to my past couple sales jobs. One of the things that I saw often happen, in addition to your, compensation plan, they would have what they would call spiffs. And I would see that, the companies I worked at would constantly have these like end of month, end of quarter spiffs. And so the person that gets the most meetings today gets, additional $500 or whatever the situation might be. And back to my kids, I correlate that to like junk food. I this morning it's funny, I saw a video on TikTok of this mom who makes her daughter what does she call it? It was like princess tea. And it's basically it's like Kool-Aid plus sugar plus honey plus Sprite. It was just sugar upon sugar upon sugar. And she would give that to her kid before all of her little, like cheer, like little like kid contest things. And of course, the kid would be flying around like a crazy person and then obviously crash hard. And so the problem that I have with spiffs is it does spike the motivation, but then it fades. You haven't taught, principles, and you haven't really impacted the long term of the organization. Now I get it, financially sometimes this does make sense. But the problem is it trained all of our sales team members to be like, okay, hold back your deals. And we would constantly do this. We'd be like, okay, we know that they're going to probably do another spiff in the last week of the month, last week of the quarter. So let's just hold back our deals from closing so we can get, double compensation. And I just think that, it does become a slippery slope. And so I think for, the mighty middle, that 60%, they do need consistent, compensation clarity, but also achievable acceleration paths. And I think if you focus on that, and I think you could have a lot better success because sometimes the the compensation plans that are put in place, they often significantly reward the top 20%, but they kind of unintentionally, protects the middle from ever breaking through. And so you really have some issues where is these overcomplicated commission structures, they really can kill motivation. And so I think that, back to my comment before about, the CRM insights, where a really strong sales leader could look at the data and help understand, where that salesperson needs some support or direction to get to the next stage of the sales cycle. I think the compensation plans should be audited exactly the same way, looking at, where the breakpoints are. Because you might find that if the compensation is either too complicated in how they earn money, or it's just really unachievable for that 60%, you're just basically killing any kind of potential of that person getting motivated to becoming a top performer. So I think that that is what I wanted to make sure is clear, is that obviously if you're in sales, your total compensation plans is very important. Most salespeople are motivated by money, but I think there are other things that you can do if you really understand your sales culture. So, for example, when I was in sales in the last couple of jobs before I became a business person, one of my biggest motivations was they had like a leaderboard that was a visual thing on the wall in like the sales room that we all were in. And when my name got added to there, it was just so exciting. And then if I was really close to being added, that was motivation. Now again, when I got rewarded for doing a good job with compensation on the money side, I loved it. But I think I found the recognition and the potential of being a top performer, that almost was more powerful than the extra money. And so I wanted to recommend that when you're analyzing where you're having some breakpoints in your compensation plan, you got to think about it from a human point of view and understand that everyone is built differently, just like my daughters. And if I tried forcing, that money motivator on my second kid, I can pretty much guarantee a lot of her major success she had wouldn't have happened. And so, things like fancy dinners or we'll agree to get you a puppy and all the things that, maybe I'm a bad parent, but all the things that parents do to try to motivate their kids to live a healthier life and living their best, possible version of themselves. I feel like there are different ways to how to, slice and dice that to make sure you're encouraging the right behaviors, not only short term, but also long term.
Hmm. I like that. I have a new nickname. Call him Gucci and Sushi.
Oh my God, that's hysterical. That literally is. That's Lexi's Gucci and Ella's Sushi, I assume. That's really
Yeah,
cute.
and just so you know, I'm not an or girl. I'm an and
I know.
girl, so I'm Gucci and Sushi.
You are
But,
hysterical.
I think like the way you were talking to is it really is interesting how sales gets so disassociated from the majority goals of the business by their individual goals. And I understand, I think a lot of sales cultures are maybe a little outdated and have to adapt and adjust. But, the whole point of this podcast is to talk about revenue. And this is one of the ways in which you're probably leaving it on the table. Like marketing is doing all this great work. And if you're only closing 20%, that's, of even the SQLs, like once you're getting it down the pipeline, you're leaving so much on the table. And then you're also not able to feed back great information to the marketing team because you have less data, because you have an underperforming sales team or a mediocre one. Um, and so, selfishly, as a marketer, feeding all that information back, like it is supposed to be a nice loop. And that's how you get sales to completely perform with this full pipeline over and over again and to keep learning and growing and creating better opportunities for prospects and your sales team. You can't really do that with such a small sample size. My
Hmm.
data brain just is like, that is just so inefficient.
You
We
made a comment
digress.
that I wanted to add on one more thing that, we did spend a lot of time on this episode talking about the sales team, which obviously is an area that we get quite invested in. But, I started thinking about it as you just were talking, there is opportunity for the head of marketing or the head of the company on the CEO side to also make an impact here. So I want to maybe share a thought there for a second because that's a part that I don't see happen often. And again, I'm just trying to find creative ways to disrupt this, which obviously is the motivation we have around creating this podcast on the revenue rewired side. But gosh, if we could find a way to get the other teams to be involved and understand how the sales team, ticks, I think the better off it could be on creating alignment. So, for example, this is maybe a little silly sounding, but what if like the CMO was given the opportunity to help the sales team from a compensation perspective and not make it all about closing a deal, but thinking about the entire brand because the sales teams typically do have a pretty exciting network extension of the organization. And so, when I think about it, it's like if the marketing team is creating really smart, thought-provoking content and the marketing team puts it out there with the idea that we want this content to generate, leads to go to turn into marketing qualified leads, to turn into sales qualified leads. There isn't any reason why the sales team, in theory, couldn't leverage that content, but find a way to incentivize them so they feel like there's a benefit to them of using their time to be promoting stuff. So again, we've done this a little bit at our own agency where you almost could have like mini win contests. And again, I know I poo-pooed the spiff idea before because it was heavily tied to money, but you could do consistent things around, hey, we're gonna have like, I don't know, a content assisted pipeline contest. And we're tying it to the behavior, not the outcome. So that way the sales team could actually be focused on supporting the marketing team, kind of helping themselves. It's almost like help me to help you type of stuff. And I feel like that could be a really creative thing that the organization could be like, look, we want marketing and sales to be aligned and you're all working together to help each other. And so the only way we're going to get, depth and breadth and reach with all of this stuff is if you guys get involved. And so that could be a really kind of interesting thing. And then I think the second part is, and this actually happened in one company I worked at, and I was pretty impressed. It was scary at first, but I was impressed by the outcome. You know, the the head of the company, and I think it was a CEO back then, he would look at all of the data around the sales side. And, he made a presentation, I guess, to the leadership team. I wasn't part of it then, but I heard about it because I was really close friends with the director of our sales team. And he let me know that the CEO made a case that we are seeing the same people over and over again hitting their goals. But we're not seeing a correlation to their efforts being the reason why they're having consistent performance. It was almost like basically the company was overpaying on commissions based upon familiarity and not based upon growth. And so we started having this
Mm.
conversation of like, are they just getting this compensation because they just happen to either be lucky or they were assigned clients that are consistently buying from us and they're really not doing anything. And so I think the that CEO found out that the top people in that 60% range were the ones that week after week after week were having the most impressive improvements in their metrics. Things like number of meetings they were securing, and number of proposals they were closing. But other reasons why they weren't hitting their goals were tied to things that were past that proposal stage, like I mentioned earlier on. That's what kind of sparked that idea. But I think there is like, if you're not living day in, day out inside the sales organization, often you can see things clearer than the sales team can. And so if the
Mm.
CEO treats it from a level of respect and seeking out facts and not just, leading by fear, which unfortunately I have worked for people like that, and it's not healthy, that person can come in and be like, hey, you know, focusing on that 60%, we've noticed these four or five people the last month they've had significant improvements, but no one's recognizing them because they're sitting in that 60% messy middle, kind of area. And so, one, I think we need to find a better way to motivate people and recognize people for having some pretty impressive performance, because that might actually tie into improving their confidence. And then next thing you know, they're up in that top 20%. And then potentially now they're coming in like a bull in a china shop because they now have learned behaviors and figure out how to motivate themselves to doing the right activities. And if the top 20% have gotten fat and lazy, which I've seen happen in too many companies, now all of a sudden they might actually add a whole nother level of interesting impact where their other peers are like, oh my gosh, this guy Jay just showed up in our top 20% team and he's now just flying by us. I better get off my seat and do some more things, and maybe we could help each other. And that I think is where it's
Hmm.
super exciting. So I wanted just to share that as you were talking. I started thinking about it. I just don't want to put all of this pressure on only the sales team to have to be the ones to address, the motivations and the compensation and whatnot, and figure out if the company can create a culture where we're all in this together, kumbaya type of silliness, but it really works. I think that you all would have a lot better success.
I could not agree more. I think that was a perfect way to wrap this one up.
Oh, good.
So, yes, I think, sales teams get a bad rap, but if sales and marketing could just be friends a little more, we'd have a lot better results for everyone. So,
I love
we
that.
hope you all enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to hearing questions and seeing you next week. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for tuning in to the Revenue Rewired podcast. Send us your questions to podcast@stringcaninteractive.com and follow us for more insights to drive your business forward.